Today on the LowDOWN, a Down syndrome podcast, DSRF therapists and teachers give us a lowdown on lessons they learned while working with people with Down syndrome. Over to you, Hannah and Marla.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi there, and welcome to the Lowdown. I hope you're well. I'm Marla Fulden, and I'm here today with my fabulous co-host, Hannah Mahmood. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Marla. How are you?
Ooh, I'm ready. I'm fired up.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one.
It absolutely will. Today's episode could have many titles, actually. We could call it Hindsight, or What We've Learned, or Ooh, I Wish I Saw That Coming. You get the idea. Today, we're combining the clinical experience of a whole panel of our staff to discuss our sort of clinical lessons learned for topic areas that come up again and again. And today we have representation from SLP, OT, behavior, counseling, and education. All of our panel members have been working with people with Down syndrome for at least a decade, which makes us all feel really old. We actually added it up before we started today, and it's a combined, how many?
79 years combined experience.
Whew, that's a lot. That's a lot of years.
Yep.
So we've been doing this for a minute, you know? The point is, yeah, it's been a long time, and we've seen some of the same situations play out repeatedly. And our purpose for this episode is really to galvanize anybody who's kind of on the fence about tackling an issue that their child or student is experiencing, who might be thinking like, well, this will probably go away eventually. So if that's you, then tune in.
Tune in, exactly. And we are going to work our way through a few topics here. We'll have an interdisciplinary chat about what we've observed when the topic area is managed, and then compare it to when it's left unaddressed and what kind of results from that. Marlon, I do want to put a disclaimer here that if you have recently received a diagnosis that you're going to have a little one with Down syndrome, or you've just welcomed a little one into your family, this episode may not be for you at the moment. We want you to just take in the loveliness of your little one and maybe come back to this episode a little bit later when you're kind of ready to hear some more of this information. Let's dive right into this. For the sake of time, all of our guests are repeaters on the Lowdown, so we're very happy to have them back. But we thought it would be great for our listeners to just get a quick little intro from everybody. So would you guys like to state your name and your role at the DSRF? So we'll start off with you.
Okay, I'm Susan Fawcett, and I'm the Director of Behavior Therapy and Family Support here at DSRF. And I'm 19 of the 78 years.
Wow. Yeah. All right.
My name is Riley Rosebush, and I'm the Senior SLP at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, and I have been here for almost 10 years.
Amazing. Love this.
All right. Hi, I'm Eleanor Stewart. I'm the Director of Education Programs and Services, and I am 14 of the 79 years.
79, yeah. Wow. And lastly,
my name's Danielle McKinney. I'm the senior teacher at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, and I have been here for almost 11 of those years.
Wow. You guys are getting some good information today from all this group. We're very excited. All right, guys, are you ready to dive in? Should we do this thing? All right, so let's just start by talking about behavior. It's a huge topic. Lots of parents are worrying about it, asking questions about it. Let's just start off with education for fun. What have you guys observed when tricky behaviors are strategically addressed in your line of work?
Well, I'll start, Danielle. I think I'd say when they're strategically addressed, so there's a plan. And there's I think it's always important to say that the plan doesn't always work immediately.
Yeah.
And that it's really good to have a support team where you can vent and talk about when the plan doesn't work and make those kind of micro adjustments. And usually it is just like one little tweak you need to make, whether it's where you put your chair, what activity you start with, or what reward you're using. But when you get to apply a plan that you've put some thought into and some collaboration, it feels really good and rewarding. And especially from a teacher's point of view, you are able to have attention, and that's what that's our biggest focus, is trying to get our students to attend to what we're trying to teach and learn. And then from there, you start to see progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess knowing where the plan came from and what is causing or possibly causing the behavior is always a good place to start. Usually it's about motivation and addressing, all the things that contribute to a motivated learner are usually where we start.
Yeah.
But also realizing that, the plan doesn't always work. And sometimes it's our fault, right? It's not about, it's more so about us having the knowledge and understanding of what we can do to make a successful learning experience.
And sometimes kids surprise you, right? Sometimes you're like, okay, I've made the coolest thing ever. And the student is like, for sure going to love it because it's so unique and like individual to them. And then they hate it. And you're like, what, why? And that does happen. Like sometimes you try your best to like get all the motivation. And for whatever reason, they had a bad sleep or whatever. And it's not the day for that, but you can try again.
Yeah.
The same thing.
Exactly. And that's the thing, like it's important to kind of also consider how addressing these things can impact their participation, like whether it's short-term in the session or long-term. So kind of moving over to you, Susan, and Riley as well, please, everyone feel free to chime in as you need to. What happens when behavior isn't worked on? Like, does it just go away, or, like the perception is very different from the reality. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked that. Does it go away? Because actually, I would say in most cases, no, it doesn't. And so one of the things that, I really would love to get across here is that when kids with Down syndrome are small, they're extremely cute. They're very charming. You can pick them up and move them if they're not doing what you need them to do. But you have to keep in mind that those cute, charming little kidlets are going to get older and bigger. And they don't necessarily grow out of problem behavior like typically developing kids often do. And so it's good to have some strategies early on.
Yeah. You did mention that, it's harder for our guys with Down syndrome to grow out of these behaviors compared to like their typically developing peers. Like, what is the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so they definitely have a tendency to develop bad habits or be more rigid. And then it's just really harder to break those habitual patterns in our kids compared to typically developing children. And another thing that I think can be tough for parents, especially if they have kids or educational professionals or other therapists as well, if they're used to kids who have, typically developing brains, is there is a big difference between the ability to negotiate with those kids and to reason with them, whereas that approach doesn't work for behavior for kids with Down syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a few things that come to mind with that, which are sort of playing to the child's emotions, or you're making so-and-so feel bad, or when you do this, I feel blah, blah, blah. That does not work.
Does not work
for our students. It's not an effective strategy, even though it might work with other kids of a certain age fairly well. It exhausts. I can see parents who are really tired out trying to explain why you can't do this because it makes mom mad.
Yeah.
And, try different, not harder. That doesn't work very well.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
I also think that, and this is something that you talk about a lot, Hannah, but the importance of understanding the executive functioning development really helps, to get your mind around why some of this learning is going to work out differently. And a big thing for people to just keep in mind is differences in inhibition, leading to more impulsivity, and that just takes a different approach than it would for somebody who has otherwise typically developing executive functions.
Absolutely. I'm so happy you brought that up, Riley, because there's all these little subcomponents that we take for granted because they kind of work well for a typically developing person, but inhibition, initiation, like all those things are playing into just the simple act of, doing like one little activity. So multiple playing parts. Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about why it's important to work behavior strategies. This is something that I'm sure we can all agree on. Like, we work on strategies in the clinic at DSRF, and then parents go home and they're like, doesn't work at home, or like what's the missing piece here? Like, why is it hard for it to generalize in a different environment?
Well, I would say, one of the reasons why it's hard to generalize, I'm just gonna put it out there right away, is that parents aren't doing the strategies correctly, right? Yeah. So they also, I think, have a tendency to sometimes try something once or twice and it doesn't quite work, and so they kind of give up on it. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes you have to use a behavioral strategy many times before it takes effect, because you're now interacting with your child in a different way, right? And so the kids have to be able to get used to that. But learning from the therapist at DSRF or your, therapist who you work with, or your educational professionals, and really getting down to what are the components of that strategy that make it work. Yeah. Right. So that you know that you're implementing it effectively at home. Because there's lots of little, none of the positive behavior support strategies are rocket science. They're definitely not. But at the same time, there's little pieces to each one that make it crucial that you carry all of those out. And definitely, parents 100% can get the hang of these things. I've seen it. I think we've all seen that happen time and time and time again, which is great. It just takes a little bit of learning on the parents' part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one thing that can get overlooked too is that often a child's behavior gets worse before it gets better. Yeah. And so it might feel like it's backfiring because actually the behavior has really intensified as the child's trying their own strategy to get what they want harder, while you're trying your new thing harder. And there's a negotiation period in there in the sort of social dynamic between the parent and child that can feel rocky if you're not expecting that to happen.
And that's a really good point, Marla. There's definitely a period where it's actually a law of behavior that you may see an increase in problem behavior when you change things up. Yeah. And so there is definitely an element of you just got to ride it out, right? You just have to sometimes.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of kind of trusting in the process and not expecting that instant change to happen and to kind of stick with it. It's also hard in a family situation when there's so many other things going on, and it's hard to see the progress the same way that we would see it in our short time with students. So I think there's definitely a lot of things that are kind of more complicated for the family, and it's great if we can let them know that this is normal and this is what's going to happen, and just stick with it, please trust us, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Danielle, because honestly, it can be really overwhelming for families. So I'm really glad you brought that up. It can definitely be overwhelming. So in that case, picking one strategy, getting good at it, and just going to town, you can make a lot of progress with kids' behavior with just using one or two strategies at home.
I also think that, here and at clinics, we have the benefit of having almost like an ideal environment.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
We knowing what we know in our background, we can set that up kind of from the beginning. So, when a child comes to a new environment like the DSRF or another clinic, and things are set up ideally to suit their learning needs, of course, things go a little bit smoother. So understanding the elements of the environment that are different in the clinic versus at home can really help, I think. And also, speaking back to what Susan said about how children or people with Down syndrome are just more likely to become a bit entrenched in certain routines and, have expectations, that applies to the parent and child relationship as well. So if you've always responded one way, they're going to just expect that to continue. And it really, a lot of the work that is helpful and I think needs to be done is in actually spending time with teaching the child the new expectations and new routines or whatever it is that you're working on that is, kind of has to do with the behavior. So, bringing in any of those learning strategies that we know work for all sorts of learning. So visual, social stories, things like that can really kind of get at those last pieces that are making the home environment generalization trickier.
Yeah. And I love this one piece I wanted to take out of what you just said is that parent-child relationship. So the one thing that I've learned in my time here is that the rapport piece is really important before introducing strategies. So one of the reasons why it's a bit easier for us to do it here is because we've built that trust and that rapport with the student or the client, right? So would any of you like to speak to how the importance of that rapport first before implementing any of these kind of tricky strategies?
I mean, I love talking about that.
Do it. Start us off. Excellent.
It's really important. If your child sees you as someone who's warm and loving and fun to be around, then they are going to behave better, period. And that goes for kids in a classroom as well as kids at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a saying that goes with it, which is collect before you direct. Like I always have this thing in mind of like, get this kid on my team. Like we are going to be going through this together, right? And there's going to be some back and forth negotiating around like how many times we're going to practice, what things we're going to practice, what order. The kid can say no, and I'm fine with that. But we need to stay kind of on the same page, because if we get too much into like this push-pull of I want this thing, you want this other thing, nothing gets done. Yeah. It's really hard.
And pick your battles on any given day, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me, like going back to why it might be a little bit more tricky in the home setting is about the team. And, you know, in the clinical setting, it's one person on the kids' team. Yeah. At home, it's who knows how many. And if not everybody's on the same page with, you know, implementing the strategies or even just allowing them to be tried, it can be more complicated for sure.
Absolutely.
So yeah, making sure that everyone has the same kind of knowledge and plan.
Yeah. And I like that Susan mentioned the fun piece. A lot of people, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of people are like, just being fun is going to make a difference. Have you found that? I know, Eleanor, you talked about this a bit earlier, but like to make things motivating, but that fun piece is kind of really important too, right?
Yeah, I think that gets undervalued a lot, especially in education. But I think one thing that I've noticed is I think, especially in education, when you're trying to teach specific skills and you're assessing, you're trying to show progress, it's really important to not rush those, you know, those first 3 or 4 sessions that you have with a new student or you know, or when you're at home working on some sort of skill development, like to not rush right into the teaching part, right? Really focus on the fun and setting up the expectations and that energy and keeping it fun, and then, you know, slowly moving into that. Because I think especially from our point of view, where you feel, you know, you're seeing these clients or students, individuals weekly, and you know that families are putting money into this service, and you know, there's this kind of balance of, okay, the importance of getting to skill development, working on learning those skills, but in the long run, it really, really is really beneficial to just focus those kind of first 3 sessions on rapport and relationship. And it's really cool to see now all this, there's so much out there on trauma-informed practice, and trauma-informed practice is all based on the importance of rapport and relationship building and being predictable, and safe. That's what we do here. So I think it's good that this is getting out kind of to the bigger audience, because it benefits everyone.
Yeah, not only developing rapport, but you're also learning what the child's interests are and the things that are going to work best for them when you do get down to the more structured learning and planning for progress.
And you get to see things too, like when they really love doing something, how long does that last? You know, with their favorite things, are they playing with that for like a whole session, or is even their most favorite activity still going to be 5 minutes? Because it really changes how you set up a session and how you plan to teach things, when you can see how long somebody can engage with something that's their favorite, because you know that your teaching stuff might not be their favorite, so you have to kind of adjust.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think going back to the original question of rapport, I'm thinking of all the different parenting styles there are out there and all the parents I've met. And, lots of people don't necessarily describe themselves as fun.
Yeah, that's so true.
And I think that's, it's okay. There's all sorts of different ways to be a great parent. So I think the other pieces, in addition to fun, to think about, if, fun isn't necessarily your strong suit, are just like empowering the child, making them feel empowered, making them feel involved in like the family and their own choices as much as that is valuable to them. And I think all like people and kids want to, they want to feel from their family and from people they're working with, like they're seen and heard and being listened to in whatever way. So, speech pathologists, we are used to trying to find out what people are trying to express, even if they're not using words, and trying to like kind of clue in and zero in on some of that stuff. I think helps kids feel like, they come here and they feel like, oh, like they get me here. And if you can find a way to build that in, it helps with the rapport.
Because them communicating fun could be very different for each person, right? And sometimes we're not honed in on those signals. And I've noticed that too, that sometimes one person communicating one way is it's different than another one, but if it's getting missed, then the frustration increases, damages. I just wanted to touch on one more little piece with behavior, which was the idea of a preventative behavior management. So I know that the philosophy, and Susan, please, feel free to jump in, but it's like the model is preventative here. So all the training programs, as much as possible, like your parent training program for behavior support is a preventative model. So like you said earlier, it may seem that this little tiny thing is super cute and not an issue when they're 2 or 3, but it could develop into one. And we kind of need to. So did you want to talk a little bit about the preventative aspect of that?
Sure, you're just touching on all my favorite topics. It's so great. Definitely preventative is the way to go, or preventative/early intervention. As soon as you start to see little things happening, because again, the pick 'em up and move 'em stage is one stage, but if you can't get beyond that, then, then we have 9-year-olds with Down syndrome who are being pushed in strollers, right? Because they will run off somewhere in public, or they're not safe, that sort of thing. So it's really important to take a preventative approach. And in that parent training program you mentioned, the way that I sort of, teach parents about that is that we take that approach to a lot of different things in terms of our health, right? So if you think about this last couple of years with COVID, we all did things to prevent ourselves from getting COVID, right? The hand washing and the social distancing and, vaccines and all those kinds of things. Because it's way easier and better for you to prevent something from happening in the first place than it is to, get the thing and then have to deal with it after. And that same approach works for behavior, right? Because if you can prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place when the kids are young, and by learning a few positive behavior support strategies early on, that's going to put you in better stead than having to deal with severe entrenched problem behavior when the child is older, right? Which is, it's not like you can't do anything about that. I don't want to give that message, but it's a lot harder, right? You then need intensive individualized instruction, essentially, from a board certified behavior analyst, because, but if you get at it early, you don't need that level of intervention. And then the other thing to keep in mind there, just a slightly different take on prevention, is thinking about in any given situation, it's actually also better to just prevent problem behavior from occurring in a situation where you know that it's likely to happen, right? So being a bit more specific now, if you know that in a grocery store, that's sort of my classic example, because
grocery stores are hard.
They're so hard, and I've watched a few kids in them now. So, but it's way easier to think about, how am I going to prevent my kid from grabbing everything off the shelf and from, taking off down an aisle or from going in a freezer, than it is to,
and it does happen.
to actually deal with it once it's happening. And, honestly, the parents also then are saving themselves some embarrassment too, right? And some stress if they can put strategies in place. And there are tons of strategies you can use in those instances.
And it's taking things that parents do automatically anyway. You know, every parent of a 2-year-old is at the point where they're like, well, we're going to put locks on things to prevent my child from getting in the knife drawer. You know, all of those kind of things, they happen, but the strategy needs to be applied maybe more widely and broadly, probably for a longer period of time. So anticipating like, you know, I don't think my child's going to get into the knife drawer, but they might. So I'm going to work around that and try and stay a step ahead of it, which I grant you is very difficult to do when you're doing it all day. So I think that's the other thing. It's hard.
It is. And that's the thing. Like doing things to prevent us from getting sick is hard too. You know, I don't think we all love getting tons of exercise and eating plates and plates of broccoli, but we do it. Okay, well, maybe we don't eat plates and plates of broccoli. But you know what I mean? Like those things aren't exactly easy, but it's still a better way to go than getting very, very sick.
Yeah.
Right.
And then having to undo all that after.
That's right.
And we can really speak from experience. We have families who have the very hard job of undoing when they have teenagers. And that is much harder than working on it when you have a little one. And it takes much longer. And by that point, it's kind of seeped into many aspects of life. So if it was just problem behavior at home, well, now it's at school as well. And now we can't go places. Now we can't participate in activities that our family wants to be able to do. And that does happen. We see it here. And that's why we're making such a deal out of it, because it's really hard to watch a family go through that for a long time after they realize it's kind of untenable to keep going.
It is. And Marla, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's something parents can look out for. So if you are a parent and you start thinking to yourself, I'm not going to go to the grocery store with little Freddie because he's going to engage in problem behavior, and you start restricting places that you take your child, that is a sign that you need some positive behavior support strategies like STAT. Right? You don't, that's the last thing you want to be doing, avoiding swimming pools or malls or things like that, because you know that they're not going to be well behaved once you're there.
Yeah, you're also, you're going to limit the experiences that your child has, because even though you're associating that behavior with the grocery store, you're probably in the back of your mind thinking, oh, maybe I also shouldn't go to X place. And so now you're not going to 2 things or 3 things or 4 things, and your child's just not getting that, breadth of experience that typical children might be getting to learn about the world. And that really can affect, language development and education, prior knowledge that they need to learn new things. So yeah, it is, as much as we were looking at the big picture of like, where could this go if we don't address it now? It could also be kind of affecting the here and now.
Yeah. And certainly it contributes to family sense of isolation. I mean, I think our collective heart just breaks when we see families who can't go places safely, or they have to do the sort of complicated tag teaming. I'll stay home with child A and you can go out with child B. We don't want that.
It's not good for anyone's overall mental health either, right? Yeah.
I, from my own limited experience as a new parent, so one thing that I kind of tried to apply from my, experience here, and thinking, knowing that, with Susan or somebody who's like a behavior professional is helping and trying to work on these things, they set up practice times. So, it's a supported and kind of front loaded time to go do something. So what I did, and I think worked well, is instead of just going to the grocery store and thinking like, I'm going to get all my shopping done and everything's going to be normal. We would go and I would think of it more as like a practice time. And have, reduced expectations for how much shopping we would do, for example, but, focusing on the behavior aspect.
The goal is different in that case.
The goal is different. And thinking that you can, it's worth it to take time to practice if something is tricky. And it might seem like you're going slow or it's going really slow, but that effort like pays off. You're going to spend the time kind of one way or another.
No, I love that idea, Riley, because it's like if you're going grocery store shopping, you're thinking, I have to get this, I have to get home in this time. So if it's just a practice period, then you're not worried about all the extraneous stuff. You're just like, we're just going to go to practice. Not going to have to worry about getting groceries or getting home in enough time. So I think that's, a fantastic example. I feel like this is going to be on your list too, Susan, because I feel like this is one of the things that as a therapist I've learned and continue to learn and try to instill in anybody who wants to know how to work with people with Down syndrome. But the idea of positive reinforcement. It is like probably one of the biggest things I've learned, and I still keep trying to remind myself how crucial it is and how undervalued it is.
Yeah.
So take it away, panel. Who wants
I'm
to
gonna
talk
let
about
somebody else go first.
Okay. Eleanor, what are your thoughts on positive
Oh,
reinforcement?
I was just going to say that it's also so much easier
Oh, yes.
positive reinforcement than have to, respond to a problem behavior. And it makes, in my practice, and just like Riley, as a new parent, it's just a nice thing to do, and then you feel good about yourself too. You're like, yeah, my child's doing something right, and I get to talk about it finally. I think we talk about the bucket a lot here, and if you can fill your student's bucket or your child's bucket with that positive reinforcement and just positive time, Susan likes to talk about that, positive attention and positive interactions, that's really beneficial. I think from a teaching point of view, I think it's much easier for us to give positive reinforcement because that's our job, and we're attuned to it, and we're constantly, our job is to motivate the child to continue to do more. So I feel like we're doing it all the time. But I think, I think when you're run down and exhausted and tired, it's really hard to see those moments or those seconds. And the more you can do to highlight them, the more likely that positive behavior is going to be repeated and seen more.
And it does kind of affirm to both you and the child that you're with that you, again, are on that same team, and it's kind of acknowledging that, like, oh, I see you doing the right thing. Yeah. I'm really happy about that. And that the more explicit you can make that, and the more in the child's sort of currency and language, right? So some kids love high fives. You kind of gotta know what your kid's currency is. What do they love to talk about, do whatever, and pay them in that currency, right? Reward them in the way that they like to be rewarded, which sometimes is a little goofy, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Just a smile sometimes is enough, right?
Yeah.
I think too, like also setting it up so that positive reinforcement can be authentic. So you're setting up the situation so that they can be successful, knowing, maybe starting with something that's a little bit easier that they for sure are going to be able to achieve, and then providing that positive reinforcement right away. Absolutely. So that, they really believe in you.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And that was, Marla, I like that you brought up being explicit and specific about what. There's a lot, you often hear like, good job, great work.
Oh, and I do it too. Yeah. Totally. I totally do it. Yeah. And then I'm like, Marley, you know better than that. Do that. What was good about it to say? Yeah. And I think we all know that we're not perfect by a long stretch, and we're continuing to learn in our careers. And we don't expect anybody else to be perfect either. Yeah. But these are things to try to aim for to make your life easier, right?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's really obvious what the good job is, and so a good job will do. But if, the task is a little more complicated, then you want to point out exactly, like, I like the way you read, all the way to the end without stopping. That's something that we need to point out is the purpose of a sentence and period. Nerdy teacher talk right there.
Yeah, I feel like that was all, that's basically it in a nutshell, right? That we should be doing those things. I think the main thing I might want to say about positive reinforcement as it relates to parents in particular, we're all teachers and therapists sitting in this room. And so we were taught to do these things. We know that behaviorally it's really important to do these things. We are, convinced of it, right? We don't need convincing that positive reinforcement is a good idea, and that it works really well to develop all kinds of adaptive behaviors. But I think for parents, it's often not as like not something they naturally gravitate towards doing. I don't think, you know, in natural life, all of us go around
Constantly
praising each other, right? That's not something we do. It's also not a way that a lot of us were brought up, right? I know I was brought up with parents who did not use a whole lot of positive reinforcement, especially in the form of verbal praise, right? So, and I think that's true of a lot of, you know, the parents that we have around here now, right? They weren't brought up in that way. And so it's not as natural a thing for them. And I remember just being very struck by when I did do the project on you know, help developing the parent training program. And when I started, actually, I got this, of course, data on how much parents were actually praising their kids. And it was so low. It was just like, I mean, I knew it was not going to be as much as we would all do it, but I was not expecting it to be non-existent in some cases. And so I now just tell parents, like, that is my number one thing. If there's anything that you can do to improve your relationship with your child, it is praise them, right? And like Marla said, in various ways, and taking into account their particular currency and what they really like, but just honestly, just do more of it. That's the main message for sure.
I'm going to bump us to our next topic here, which is the friend of behavioral challenges, and that is attentional challenges. And it's going to draw upon things that Riley's brought up already and Hannah around executive functioning. But this time, let's start with you, Hannah, in OT. How do you find attentional challenges like ADHD affect students' ability to learn in your sessions?
I think it's so important to, first of all, understand what ADHD is, right? I think there's so many perceptions, it's just like attention issues, but there's an attention component and then there's a hyperactivity component. So before we come up with a strategy for anything, we must first work on understanding what it is that we're trying to help with. And Riley definitely, my OT heart grew 2 sizes when Riley brought up environment and think of all the other things. Because as OTs especially, we really do like to think of the person and then their environment and then what we're asking them to do. So the environment piece is really important. Like, you know, in our sessions, you know, it's a slightly artificial environment here because it's one-to-one attention. It's like the perfectly, well, not perfect, but as close to perfect as possible workspace that we've created, right? So so those things are very hard to generalize to home or school. So then the goal is, okay, how do we figure it out in another environment, how our students can be successful? So thinking about the environment, thinking about the person, right? And especially with our guys with Down syndrome, it's important to think about on that particular day, what are the things that are working for them and what are the things that are working against them? And with attention, it's hard because there's so much going on around us all the time, especially in a busy classroom. It's like the perfect example. There's, you know, sounds, there's sights, there's other, you know, internal feelings where you're not feeling the greatest and you're trying to get all of that sorted in order to be able to do something. So from an OT perspective, I know that I've learned that we really have to look at all 3 components in order to kind of help our students be successful. So thinking about them as people, you know, where they're expected to do the work and what's the work they're expected to do. Is it super complicated? Do they maybe need, you know, this is something that I've learned from our teachers at DSRF, which is like that scaffolding thing, like slowly working our way towards that goal. And then the hyperactivity piece is a whole other ball of yarn, right? Like, it's like, okay, how are we helping you get what you need? And I'm not going to do a full deep dive into sensory. There'll be another podcast episode about that. But thinking about the hyperactivity component and how can we help our, you know, our kids and our students be able to get their bodies in that space where their minds and bodies are working together.
And to provide some examples for the kinds of things that we do to modify that we have found work, we move furniture around. Before you get here, we are moving things, we're emptying out. Sometimes we really empty out our whole room. Things that we know are going to be a problem, we throw that under the prevention umbrella and we say, well, we're just going to take that out and we're going to move this thing. We're going to, you know, hide the Barbie doll if that's going to be a problem. We're going to put that in another room. we're going to keep all of our activities in a tub and putting them out one at a time so we can focus in. That's a Riley Rosebush special there.
Yes.
You know, and then when it comes down to practicing something that's new and hard, well, we're going to do what seems achievable. And we don't plan necessarily how many that is until we see the kid on the day, because we need to take into account how much sleep have they had, how are they feeling. That's why we ask these questions, because then we kind of recalculate and recalibrate. How much are we going to push today? What new things are we going to try? Are we going to skip that new hard thing that I wanted to do because you didn't sleep at all or whatever? You know, we change things every day depending on, you know, who's coming in that day.
Yeah. It's all about accommodations and adaptations, right?
So I think it really helped me to start to think of attention as not just like one thing, like if somebody's paying attention or not, it's not really binary, but rather it's like a collection of processes that's happening all at once. Hannah has a very happy look on her face. Okay, great. You know, so if you could think of, you know, a big aspect of attention and a common metaphor is thinking of it as like a spotlight. So what is your child's like spotlight on right now? And if there's something you want them to be paying attention to you, how do you like draw that spotlight over? And you know, sometimes we might call it like, how do you make like an attention vortex? Like, how do you make something so interesting to them that it like sucks that spotlight over and keeps it for as long as possible? And, you know, something I try to think about is like, how do you like, capture their interest, like that kind of like put a cowbell on it, like situation so that, it, you know, it stands out. And we always say, like, if you want a person with Down syndrome, like to learn something new, like you need to make a visual to go with it. So including like visuals in your teaching plan. If you can praise it, you know, they're going to like pay attention to it and learn about it. All that is really helpful. And really, if they can't like pay attention to it, then they can't like process it. They can't remember it. They can't encode it. They can't learn it. So it's a really good thing to think about when you're kind of trying to, you know, think about teaching something new overall. Like, how do you include all of these components? To get at what they need to pay attention and therefore to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's another component. There's the components to everything. That's the tagline for this one. There's components to everything. Because with attention issues, it's like, you know, are their eyes able to focus on what they're doing? You know, so there's like so many little things that I think often we don't think about that could be, and I'm sure like kind of tying it back to behavior a lot of the times, like, oh, they're just being stubborn or they're just not listening. They just don't want to do it. But it's like, I don't know if it's a want thing or is it more that they just can't and don't have the ability, right, at that point in time to do it. So,
Yeah. And there are many strategies. So we modify the environment. We make the learning goal task as exciting and as desirable as possible. But those aren't the only strategies. And we should make it clear that there are people with Down syndrome who also have ADHD and that medications for ADHD do work. And we have seen it time and time again where a child wasn't really able to gain very much that was meaningful from a learning environment until the tool of medicine was used to support them. And when you think about your child's experience in school, and if they need something like medication and don't have it, then their school experience is negative. And they learn quickly to not like school because they get in trouble a lot. And the parents become very stressed out too because all they hear about school is bad. And I really don't like that situation. That's a whole other topic about school-home communication. But thinking of undoing, you have a lot of undoing that needs to happen if you don't opt in on some of the tools that are needed, and then you have to reform a relationship with learning and education at a later time when your kid is 10, 12, 15. And that's much harder. Again, it's much harder to do. So we would love for the relationship between the child and their education to be a positive one. And sometimes that requires tools that go beyond environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you guys in education seen a difference between when a child that has an ADHD diagnosis and then adds the tool of medication to their sort of tool belt? Have you guys noticed a difference in how much you can do with the child, how much they can gain from the experience?
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that or witnessed that a few times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, It works.
It does work. Yeah.
It really comes down to that. It works. Yeah.
And we've also been on that journey with parents, right? Because there's a lot of fear around going on medications, and that's totally, legit. And I think, and I think it takes a while to find the right dose and the right medication. And I think going through that journey, you really see the changes where there's a complete, even just like the whole body just calms, and they're sitting at a table for more than 5 minutes, where previous to that you wouldn't have seen
or 5 seconds.
Or just their eyes. Sometimes just their eyes are able to focus on one thing. It's not even their wiggly body. It's sometimes just when they're not. I've seen kids who aren't medicated, and then they are, and before their eyes were sort of like, and their head was darting around everywhere, right? And how you can't learn like that. You can't,
no. And I think it's like even just like beyond sitting at a desk to do an activity, just like navigating your environment, right? Like just stepping out into the playground or going to the mall. Like it's just their entire quality of life can be impacted for the positive if we take that.
And families.
And families' lives.
And families too, right? Yeah. Because trying to keep somebody safe who's really, really impulsive and trying to make sure that they have a good quality of life is really extra challenging, right? And sometimes, like, we'll be realistic, sometimes it takes more than one type of medication or tweaking the dose, and that's not up to anybody here, but families will share that, we're trying something new, we're trying something different. It's not always like your bingo the first time, but when it works, my goodness, does it work? And if you're on the fence about should we, shouldn't we, it's something to consider for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of families I've worked with who, there maybe is that attention piece and it might not be diagnosed yet, but they do want to try all the things. Like maybe we're just not practicing enough, or maybe we're just, need to change the time of day, or, miss some of school so that it's not so much going on that day, to really be able to focus on therapy. And I think, sometimes a lot of time is put in trying all those other things when, you could also consider, some other kind of intervention, which also doesn't have to be forever. You can try it and decide that, let's go back to, tweaking some of those other things instead.
Yeah. And I'm so happy you brought that up, because just specifically talking about ADHD medications, if you wean, like I think a lot of parents are worried about side effects. A lot of my families that have tried it are like, my kid isn't the same anymore or whatever. But like, it's worth a try, because when you wean them off, there's no long-term effects that are going to stay so it's worth a shot to start off slow and see if that can actually make a difference for sure. Yeah.
It's a tool. It's a tool, one of many
solutions.
And sometimes it's a tool that really, really helps, right?
Yep.
Doesn't work 100%. For everybody, but sometimes.
Yeah. I had a session this morning and it was kind of cute and funny at the time, but now I'm thinking about it again, and it's a little bit like, I feel for him, because I think Mom said, focus, and he says, I am focusing, but everything you're doing looks nothing like focusing, but in his mind he feels like he's focusing,
doing his best.
Right?
Yeah.
So
oh boy. I can picture it. So sometimes there's another name for another cluster of noticeable things, and that name is autism spectrum, or autism in general. And so let's talk about what happens when that diagnosis comes early versus when it comes later, and how that affects families, because it's in the news and it's in the new AAP guidelines, just in case you're wondering. We'll have more to say on that in another episode. But this is a huge one for families, and there might be reasons that they want to go for it early or not. What have people's experiences here been like around looking for an ASD diagnosis, or really, really not wanting to get an ASD diagnosis? What are people's thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was like 9 questions in one, Marla.
I know. I know.
I mean, I can just kick it off by saying that I think the idea of that second diagnosis for some parents, from this perspective, for some parents, it's fine. It's like, oh, okay, there's a reason why my kid is not behaving like other kids with Down syndrome I see, and they feel relieved when a therapist brings it up, or a pediatrician. But I think for other parents, it's really hard. You know, it's a very difficult thing to wrap their head around that, but my child has Down syndrome. That's what they have. And I've now just come to grips with that. And now you're telling me they have this other thing that is, you know, kind of scary. And so some parents, it's a really, really tough thing to deal with. And so I think for, you know, educators and therapists, sometimes we see these signs and we're pretty sure that that's what's going on. But just being really careful about the way we bring it up with families. Right. And I've heard some not so good stories about not of course anybody in this building, but other therapists who maybe aren't as aware of the nuances of the dual diagnosis. And, you know, when it's brought up to parents, it's not in a super sensitive way. And yeah, it can just be really tough.
I think as far as like families that I've seen go through getting a dual diagnosis, just kind of that mindset, and we're trying to educate more and have more parents who have been through the experience to share that. But that mindset that, you know, your child is still your child. Nothing has changed by calling it this. Instead, we just have maybe a new set of insights that we can apply, or more strategies that make more sense, you know, for the situation. So I think, yeah, as much as we can help people to see that.
I think a lot of times parents feel kicked out of the group of Down syndrome parent. And that's just not true. There's actually far, far more families who have this experience that maybe just don't share about it, or it's just not known publicly. But it's around 17% of people with Down syndrome also have autism. That's a lot. And so you're still in a group. Don't worry about it. And it's a bit of a different group maybe, but you're still in a group. And we as the DSRF are trying to do more to make sure that people know that it's a group and you're not just off on your own then when you get an additional diagnosis.
Yeah. And kind of speaking to what Susan said earlier, like there's parents look at it so differently. I've had conversations, and it is a very tough conversation to have. So like, how do you bring it up? It is something that it can be life-changing and perspective-changing for a lot of families, but I've had experiences where families are not ready for it, don't want to talk about it. We're just, you know, and we make space for them. But then there's families that are like, some families have an inkling that something is different, or there's an additional thing to kind of think about. So there's just like this big sigh of relief when you finally have the conversation. You're like, yeah, I've been thinking about that. So like, okay, deep breath, right? So let's talk about it. And then there's conversations with families like, yep, I feel like this is the situation. I want my kid to get as much support as I can. Let's do this. So it's just like navigating, that conversation can be very tricky, and we kind of want families that are listening to this to know about that we want to do it in the most respectful and, you know, safe way as possible. But it is something that you guys can also bring up if you're ever curious, right? Like we can make the space for you to discuss it with you as well, because there is a prevalence of it. So it's good to kind of include it into the conversation.
And I think we're trying to do a better job at a lot of things, but we are trying to include more information about various kinds of dual diagnoses or various like forms of neurodiversity to make it just something that we speak about earlier and more often, so that it's in people's mind and in people's like kind of repertoire of things they might know more about, because by not talking about things, it doesn't help anything.
You're making it like more like it's just if we're hiding around or, you know, being scared about talking about it, then it just makes us sound more scary, right? So if it's like, okay, let's just put it out there. You know, Marla and I did an interview with I think it was in our season 5 with a physician, Dr. Noemi Spinazzi, who said, you know, at a certain point we need to kind of now think about Down syndrome or autism as being something we need to exclude, right? Like, let's just assume that it could be an issue, it could be something, an additional diagnosis for a population. Let's figure out a way to take it out of, you know? So just a perspective shift, I think, sometimes is needed, but it's slow.
And I do think there's like a general perspective shift happening a little bit. And, you know, parents of kind of like, you know, the current generation that are parents and us all here in this room, like, also grew up, I think, during a time where there was a real lack of like representation in terms of diversity. So a lot of misunderstanding around, Down syndrome alone, and a lot of misunderstanding and negative representations around people with autism or autistic people. And, I think it's hopefully all changing, but very slowly.
Yes.
And I just hope that some of that fear goes away, because of course parents, what they're seem to me to be bringing to the table is just wanting the best for their kids, like kind of no matter what, and whatever that means to them. And of course that's influenced by, what we hear about and see everywhere in society.
Yeah, and you see the full picture of autism,
exactly.
right? Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I was just in a meeting with a family where we brought up the same topic.
Yeah.
If they'd ever thought about exploring that diagnosis of ASD. And just speaking to kind of Riley, like, it really is the family's choice, because in that scenario, the family was, they thought about it and they didn't think that getting the diagnosis at this point in this young person's life was going to change anything in the way that she attended school, or the way that what services she received. So yeah, like it's interesting to think, or just to acknowledge and accept every family's kind of choice around it. And
Absolutely.
That's right. And knowing that we all respect your decision, whatever that is, as the parents of this child, and we are going to be good therapists and teachers for your kids no matter what you decide. So don't be afraid to voice your opinion about it, or say if you're uncomfortable with the possibility of getting a dual diagnosis, then it definitely doesn't need to happen.
Yeah.
And parents often ask, like, one of the big questions is, are you gonna, like, how will this change, like, our treatment plan, or what we're gonna be doing? And just for parents to know that, like, since we all know about strategies that work for all sorts of learners, like, most likely the way that we see or treat or plan for your child won't change. Sometimes, and especially here in BC, there's access to different resources out in the community, possibly, or in schools, but here we're not going to change how we see or treat or teach a child before and after a diagnosis.
Exactly.
I think it does, though, on the other side of the same coin, it absolutely impacts school. There are many services through schools that require a label. I don't agree with that, but that is how it is. And there are behavior support services in school. There's more EA time. Is more attention to what kind of visuals need to be there to make the day successful. That happens when you have an additional label. So there's many things to consider. But
all right,
you can still have you can still get through your day.
You can still,
I don't think it's I don't want it to seem like, this additional diagnosis means that, like, things are over. You can still have a really fulfilling life. And I think at the DSRF, we're trying to make that clear too, that having an additional diagnosis is just part of life, and people can still have a really wonderful time with their family and doing the things that they like to do.
Okay, let's do a topic shift, you guys. All right, now we're talking about another really good one. AAC, which stands for
Riley's
the
eyes
SLPs. Riley's eyes are like, yes, this is a great topic, because I feel like I would love to hear from our SLPs and from our teachers as well. But so for those of you who are not familiar, AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. It is a hot topic all the time at the DSRF because there's lots of misconceptions about it. But I would love to start off with our resident SLPs here. What do you notice when students are set up with an AEC device that gets used?
You want to go first?
Sure,
Marla?
I'll go for it. I think you can say it in the relief of it. So what doesn't happen when a student has a communication system that works for them and all the tools that they need, which may or may not be an AAC high-tech or low-tech device, they are calmer. they are less frustrated. The people around them understand effectively what they're trying to say, and the child has an easier day. They're more able to socialize. They can participate in class. They can ask for things in unfamiliar environments more successfully. The contrast to that is if somebody doesn't have an AAC device and they need one, then they're dependent almost exclusively on some person in their life who's going to translate for them. And that person needs to go everywhere and do everything with them, essentially, because they can't communicate effectively independently, which is participation limiting and in socially limiting in a huge way, and definitely limits their education too. We feel very strongly about this. Soapbox over. Okay.
Oh, I think you're just getting started.
I was just going to say,
started.
They just scratched the surface there, Marla.
It's true. Riley, what do you want to add?
Oh, yeah, all of that. But yeah, it's we've already talked about like learning and growing, and just it's such a interesting time because I think the entire like profession of speech and language pathology is learning and changing when it comes to greater promotion and acceptance of AAC. So it's we're still in this period where there is like some doubt and misinformation and just misunderstanding about the strategy in general. And so, we have all tried our best to just continue our education and work on this as, communication professionals. And it's surprising how intense the resistance can be from other professionals or schools sometimes. And I really do understand why parents can be resistant to this suggestion or not understand it, because how would you know everything that there is to know? But yeah, it's interesting when we still hear that schools don't agree or don't want to implement it or think it's too much work or something like that. And I think
that grinds my gears. Too much work.
Yeah. And and what Marla said is, so you ask schools, you ask parents, like, what is your biggest priority for your child? Like, what do you want to work on? What's your main goal? And in the population of people with Down syndrome, 99% of the time it's communication, expressive communication. And so you offer a solution that of course is not a magic anything. It's, takes work, it's something to learn, but can be a really good solution. And in some cases is like one of the only great solutions that's going to be very effective. And you can still get people who just like aren't sure and need, again, we talk about giving people time, but need more time to think about it. So and I think there's an idea that if a child goes to speech therapy, it's going to cause them to talk.
That's a very good. Would you mind expanding on that? Because that's a huge misconception that if they're going to start using an AAC device, they're not going to learn how to talk.
I think what Hina said is one of the pieces of kind of like misunderstanding and misinformation that still exists. And you hear it about, all sorts of devices, visuals, but also about even just simply using sign language to support somebody. You hear all the time that if you use these strategies, that it will prevent or slow down the child's development of speech or expressive language. Susan's having the shivers. And it's just, and this is part of, the profession being young, is that, the research is a bit current or it's still in progress, but all the research that we have does highly suggest that using AAC or supporting expressive communication only helps most people to improve their expressive language overall. In a lot of cases, improve their spoken language, but overall improve how much they can express themselves. And so that's, really good news. And sometimes it's just explaining that and people say, okay, we're on board now. Just needed that piece of information. But, there's so much that has to go into a person being able to use speech, like verbal speech, for their main form of communication. It's a physical process, it's a cognitive process, it's there's a nervous system involvement. And when people are, especially young kids, are learning and growing, things aren't just always set up for that to be successful for them as much as they need. So, we have all these kids who have these great ideas, all these really important things they want to say and express and choose and comment on, and until they have a way that works for them, they're not going to be able to do that. So, speech people with Down syndrome often just comes online a little bit later. And so there is this tendency to want to wait and see, because we know that, speech just continues developing, and that's wonderful. But there's this whole period of time when children are young and growing in this area that they have things to say and ideas. And I think it's worthwhile for people to consider including AAC at younger ages, even if there's this idea that they may not need it for their whole lives, but it just lets them communicate now, reduce frustration now, and possibly improve their spoken and language overall. So kind of
and like technology has changed so much. I'm sure even since your time of being an SLP, like there's so many different versions of AAC, even within an iPad, right? But on, like, this is my soapbox moment really quickly as an OT, like on a fundamental level, when you say we can't use a touch chat, for example, or an iPad because we don't know how to use it. Like on a fundamental level, it's like a human rights thing. Like how can you take away a student's voice? When and it's fascinating. And I learned so much from you guys as SLPs, like how quickly some of our students can pick up on this stuff if you start early enough, right? Like, and I had a student the other day teaching me how to use touch chat. He's like in grade 4, right? He's like, oh yeah, this is what you do to find this. So it's just like how it just boggles my mind how somebody can say we don't want to, especially professionals and you OTs listening out there, embrace AAC. Otherwise, I'm going to come and get you, because it is so important. I had a parent the other day, like, oh, what would you need the iPad for? I'm like, this iPad needs to go with everywhere your little one goes, right? Like I need to use it because I need to understand what they're saying. So it's like we have to stop using that excuse of it's too hard for us to learn. There's resources that can help you how to learn it. There's ways you can do it, but no more of that excuse.
I think one of my biggest goals in my practice is always to match up as much as possible somebody's ability to have ideas with their ability to share those ideas. And for a lot of our little kids in particular, there's a huge mismatch. So the complexity of their thinking, what they want to be able to tell you about, is much, much higher than their body's ability to like do the thing, make the sounds. And so my job is to find a way to match up those things as much as possible. And the timing on that is kind of critical, because your 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds are starting school. They're going to preschool. And if you can try and imagine that situation for yourself where you want to say things and nobody understands what you're trying to say, and it's all day and it's every day, you're not going to like that place, right? And like we said, we want that relationship with education to go well, and it can go well. So we want to use all the tools, everything we possibly can, to allow our students to express what they're really thinking. And there's another misconception that when we use AAC, we should make the child really compliant and answer and model the things that we want to hear as the educators, and like, here, give me the best answer, when really the kid's like, this is boring. And then we need to provide space for that too, because we want it to be really genuine, right? And we want kids to have a full range of expression, which might be things like, I don't want to do this right now. And maybe it's not what you were hoping to hear as their SLP, but it's valid. Right? And
exactly.
that's really important.
And I think, I was just going to say to our teachers, like, I think it's so valuable to learn how you guys incorporate AAC, and what have you learned with using it with your clients as well?
Yeah, I was going to say just, after we get past that, yes, we're on board with it. There definitely is still that piece from professionals and parents and other individuals who don't understand how to use it, or, even all of the values behind it, having your own voice. This is not just a worksheet for someone who can't print or can't speak the things that they're putting into it, that this is their voice. How do we help them to learn this and get over that it's too hard, or which I think is often more, often some kind of insecurity in the professional. I don't know how to do it. I'm not willing to, I feel vulnerable trying.
I don't want to look bad.
Technology is not,
perfection.
Again, I had a student yesterday who I did something that I've never done, trying to program a button. Like, this is new.
But good for you.
Yeah, right? All new to me, but I'm like, it erased the letter. Like, so I had to walk this poor boy around the building trying to find an SOP to fix the problem that I did. But now I feel, so just, I guess just creating a space where it's okay for everyone to do what we talked about earlier, build rapport, use the things, make it fun. It doesn't have to be, used to its 100% full capacity from the beginning. It can just be exploring and getting to know it and just being casual with it.
And that's a really good point. It is not an overnight tool by any stretch of the imagination. It takes a lot of time to really, for the adults to learn it and the children to learn it. And that is okay, because we still know that it's one of the most effective tools that we have.
It's worth it.
It is worth it.
I think it's also good for the student who's using AAC to see that you don't know what you're doing, right? Like I can teach you something, or, it's okay that I don't know how to find all the words. Let's figure out how to do it. Let's model the process.
And that frustration, sorry, Susan.
It's okay.
Just that I try to use those moments when I'm trying to find a word and I can't find a word. That frustration, like I just take that second to realize like how frustrating it could be for that individual who has to use the AAC. That's their experience on a very consistent basis. And if you can't, if we as teachers and professionals can't embrace that moment of frustration and take that second to find the word, then what are we doing?
Yeah. And a side note from that is, oh my gosh, do SLPs love questions? So, come find us, come ask us. This is an area that we like to talk about, and we're happy to help out. So if it feels uncomfortable and weird, then find your SLP and see if they have some tips for you to try and make it a little bit easier. But it is a process.
Well, I will be hunting you down because I still did not fix the problem.
No problem.
I was just going to say, from the mental health perspective and from a self-esteem perspective, why not give these guys, the chance to be masterful at something, right? And to be able to show your teacher or other kids in your class how you are able to build a whole sentence with this cool thing on your iPad, right? And I just feel like that's so good for other people's perspective, their perception of our kids with Down syndrome, but also for their own self-esteem. They don't get a chance very often to feel masterful at something.
And and then just how powerful it must feel to be understood, right? So when I ask, like, how are you? Or they're trying to tell me something on their iPad, I'm like, oh yeah. And it's just like that look in their eye. They're like, you get me. Like I think we take it for granted, right? Like we're understood for the most part, but like, it's just for someone who it's so difficult for them, like Riley said, to do that expressive communication piece. But if they have this tool to be able to be understood, like, why would you not want to use that all the time? Right,
I think what a lot of people have touched on is the fact that, this is not an overnight thing. It takes a lot of input, a lot of learning. So, my last soapbox moment is that if, we don't want to do device dumping where we just give somebody a device or a program and say, go and have fun. But if this is something that you think is right for your family and your child or your student, that what we call communication partner training, just taking that time to train everybody who's going to be using it with a child, who's going to be there and available to help teach the child to use the device, understand the purpose, as you guys said, it can't be missed. So taking that time to invest in the background training, again, it seems like, we're taking 3 sessions, 4 sessions to do all of this, chatting, planning, learning, and it's a super good use of time, because holy cow, does the whole thing go way better when we spend that time.
And we can also be really purposeful in how we spend those times teaching, right? In the classroom, getting peers involved, so that they are also communication partners. There's lots you can do that will make that a meaningful experience for everyone, and not just time that's taken to do this thing that not everyone has to do.
You're absolutely right. And I think I'm gonna say a hard thing here, but it's an important one probably, and that is that not every person with Down syndrome develops verbal communication that's easily understood by other people. We would love for that to be the case, and we can do therapy until our mouths fall off. I don't know. But it's for some students, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's not the parents' fault. And it's not the student's fault. They're not lazy.
Yeah.
There are other neurological things. Speaking is a very complicated process. That's why we have to learn about it in school.
Components.
There's components everywhere. And, if you're holding out when the kid is little, thinking maybe they don't really need this, maybe you're right. When the child has reached an older school age and they're still not able to communicate effectively with the people that they really need to, family members, their EA, it's really worth thinking about it again, because the long-term implications of not being able to communicate effectively with anyone are not good. They're really isolating. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that, Susan. What happens?
I was actually just going to say about I'm glad you mentioned because a lot of our kids will definitely develop some kind of verbal language. That's almost always the case. But the intelligibility piece, the ability to be understood by others, is the really tricky part. And that, for parents who and siblings of a child with Down syndrome who know that person very, very well, it probably isn't often that hard to understand what they're talking about, because you have context and you know them really well and you've heard their speech a bazillion times. But them being able to actually communicate with other people outside the family effectively is what you really want to think about. As a parent, okay, I can understand my child, so they don't need an AAC device, right? Is something we hear. Well, I understand him, okay, so it's fine. I know what he needs, right? I know what he wants. I can anticipate those things. But, are you going to be able to do that when your son or daughter is 20 or 25, right? You need to think more long.
And also, how do you know how much you're limiting by just giving them that voice to communicate the things that you already know?
Back to that mismatch, right? Where we think we know everything that they want to talk about, but we probably don't. I mean, realistically, we don't know everything that they would ever want to say ever, right? And think about employment, think about friends, right? And we want those things for people with Down syndrome if they want them, right?
Two terms that those comments bring up for me back from school, good old grad school, it's the idea that, based on research, we found out that humans in society tend to judge people's intelligence by what they're able to say and the intelligibility of their speech and things like that. So you might be limiting people because of people's unfortunately negative perceptions of what it is that they're thinking of, their cognitive levels and stuff like that, when there might be a lot more happening. And also the idea of communication autonomy, which is I think what Susan was talking about, and that's the concept that says that everybody deserves to be able to say whatever they want to whoever they want whenever they want, and if we are only kind of providing the students the chance to communicate about things that we have pre-printed visuals for, or just something that's super structured or very familiar, and we might be we're just missing a lot of what might be going on for them.
And it's so easy to misinterpret as well, yesterday I came into the summer camp program, and I'll just call him Billy. Billy, what I interpreted was waving at me, and I was like, "Oh, hi, Billy," and I was trying to engage with him, and then he looked at me, picked up his iPad with his AAC device on it, and found the word goodbye and said goodbye, and I was like, oh, and I was like, all right, Billy, goodbye, and I left because
great example.
He didn't want to talk that, and that's totally fine.
That's so awesome.
So I think
such a great example. So now we're going to move on to another very, very big topic. I feel like I'm saying this about all the topics, which is why we're doing this episode, because they're all huge. Susan, you alluded to this just a little bit when we were talking about AAC, but mental wellness and mental health for our people with Down syndrome. Tell us all about it.
Wow.
What are, I would love to kind of just talk a little bit about, why is it so important to think about mental health at a younger age, not only when they're transitioning from high school to adulthood or,
Yeah. So, I mean, it goes right alongside what I was saying about behavior before, what I think a lot of us said about behavior before, that we want to think of things preventatively or at an early intervention, sort of in that sort of mindset, rather than trying to deal with it later once kids are already, depressed or anxious or those kinds of things, because those definitely, those diagnoses happen in people with Down syndrome for sure. But there's lots of things that parents and educators at school and out in the community and us as therapists, we can all be doing for people with Down syndrome to help them have good mental health. Definitely one of them is my biggest one, like if we have time for not much else, tell your kids they have Down syndrome. Right? It's so important. It's I can't really stress it enough. It's really important. I would say, probably in early elementary school is when I would first, you guys can all chime in too, but that's when I would first say that it's important to sort of start talking about it. Just the reason why you want to do it is because otherwise that little person is walking around and wondering, how come everything is so much harder for me? Why can't I throw a ball as far as the other kids in my class? Why is my younger sister talking more than I am? And I'm not saying they're thinking these exact things in their head in that kind of language, but I think there's still a sense. These are really empathetic kids. They pick up on emotions. They pick up really well on what other people are doing. They pay really close attention to what other people are doing. And I think they know. I know they know that they're different. And so if they have no reason why, then they start feeling kind of crummy about themselves, right? And I think for me, it's probably the biggest contributor to low self-esteem in our teens, right? And you have all heard this story, but one of the main reasons I went back and did a PhD was because I had, I'd been a speech therapist for kids here for a long time. I had them since they were, 5 or 6 years old, and they were always these like delightfully happy little kids. And, they would do all these, I'm making it sound like I've had only easy, straightforward kids in my therapy sessions.
That's not true. Yeah.
But I'm just saying, some of them sort of behaved this way. And then they got to be teenagers, and I would pull out a mirror to start working on a speech sound beside them, and they would close the mirror. And they'd say something like, I hate my face, or I'm so ugly. Or something like that. And then it would come out that, they didn't really know why their face looked different than anybody else, but they knew that it did.
Yeah. So,
and they didn't want to look at themselves anymore. So it's just a really important thing to do. And then in terms of kind of how to do it, because I know that's a tricky thing, is just being honest about it. What is it? Give them the facts. And you can sort of, tailor the way you talk about it with your child based on what their kind of cognitive level is and what they're able to understand at the time. You don't have to go into genetics necessarily unless your kid is really into science, and we definitely have some kids here who are. What you want to definitely avoid is and unfortunately I've heard this so many times, is people who say things like, well, it's just like some people have blue eyes and some people have brown eyes. Some people have Down syndrome and some people don't. And that's just not true, first of all. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are really crummy things about having Down syndrome, right? There are some good things about it. Like, they get to come here and have fun with all of us because we're, we're all so great. But there are some really crummy things about it. So I think just being honest about that is really important. So that was with regard to kind of prevention of mental health issues. That's my number one soapbox, I would say.
It's a very important soapbox for sure. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that particular thing? Have you guys had experiences with that question with your clients or your students?
I find that students who have a more positive self-regard, so they have higher self-esteem, are more likely to have friends. They're more likely to do social activities. It could be sports, it could be arts, it could be anything. They're more likely to feel that they can be employed. So I don't think overestimating how much self-esteem is important is possible. You know, it's a big factor in any teen and young adult's life.
Yeah. And I think thankfully there's more and more representation out there for people with Down syndrome, for them to look up to someone else being really successful, doing things. So I think that helps.
It does.
With that
That's
as well.
a really good point.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. And it kind of
it's
helps
so much
us.
more than when I first started
Yeah.
here, where there was nobody in media, right? Ever.
Yeah.
You never saw kids with Down syndrome in Gap commercials or
No.
whatever.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or those that are like have their own businesses and are just like out there, you know, doing amazing things. So I think helping your kids understand that the possibility that there are lots of possibilities out there. There's lots of good things, but keeping it realistic. I like that you mentioned that it is going to be hard for you at certain times, but it doesn't mean that you still can't do it. You just might need a little extra help, right? But yeah, I think that's a really important part.
I think also bringing, you know, that representation closer to them and allowing them to explore friendships with peers that have Down syndrome and to see themselves in other people.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's our final topic, Danielle. So yeah, we want to talk about friends. Really, like everyone everywhere, people with Down syndrome benefit from having friends, which sounds very obvious, but it is something that can get missed because often we're so focused on work and learning things that are hard and new things. But friends who share interests and friendships that are genuine are so important. Who wants to start here? Do we want to start with Riley this time? From a communication perspective, we try to do things that support friendships. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of things might happen when we're trying to support new friends?
Sure. I think there's a lot that can be said about this topic, and it does change drastically depending on which age group you're targeting. I tend to see a lot of younger kids because I love them. But, you know, we've been talking about some difficulties with like expressive communication and language and all this kind of stuff. And I think parents, you know, or adults in general, because we're used to friendships as being a lot about conversation, asking questions, like all this kind of high level stuff. It's difficult. And it's just really good to keep in mind that for kids, for children, you actually don't need to talk that much to have a lot of fun with other kids. So, you know, often people are asking about, you know, preschool or early elementary schools, like how do we get them to say this and this to their friend or something like that? And, you know, sometimes when we go and observe and we can point out that, wow, look, they're having a lot of fun just playing. It might be more physical play, but like this child and that child are both smiling a lot and laughing a lot, and they're taking turns in this way. You know, kids in general tend to be quite empathetic, and they accept and understand a lot of nonverbal communication. So it's totally okay to like encourage that type of play and roll with that type of communication for younger people. And then when I think, you know, as kids get older, or, you know, social interactions get more complex in different ways, thinking just a bit specifically and strategically about what communication supports could help them to be successful where things might be challenging. So taking a critical look at what interactions they're having in their day, in their school or their home or environment, wherever, and finding out like where do things break down, where do things go wrong, is rejection happening, and is there some specific kind of intervention plan support we can put in place to fix that? I'm struggling to think of a really good example. But like, you know, for example, for the child who might, you know, be pushing or grabbing something when they're, you know, other kids their age aren't doing that type of interaction anymore. Is there a specific sign or picture communication, anything that we could do that that's within the child's abilities to teach them to express what they're trying to express in a more, you know, quote unquote, acceptable way. I need to say that in a better way, but, you know, in a way that other kids will accept and kind of avoid that rejection moment.
I think that's really well put. And sometimes it's very simple stuff, like a picture that says my turn, and practicing that and learning around those things. And sometimes in our older students and teenagers, it's like, oh, this student only wants to talk about that thing that they really, really, really love, regardless of who they're with. And that makes peers a little bit more challenging, because if you get two peers and they love different topics, then how do we find this common ground and how do we relate? And a lot of that has to be taught explicitly, right? Like, you can talk about this thing you love a little bit, but we're also going to ask, you know, our friend about something that they might like to do. And practicing finding commonalities is something that we do a lot with teenagers, right? And pointing those things out, like, oh my gosh, you guys both love pizza. Like, that's amazing. And then what could we do together that involves this thing we both love, right? And making that explicit really helps to build friendships in older students too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I find it interesting that, you know, especially in like IEP meetings, there's a lot of talk around, you know, this student will learn how to take turns or, you know, ask a friend to play. When I'm sure there's at least 50% of the class who also needs to learn how to take turns and ask a friend to play and talk about things that are of interest to both of them. So yeah, like just really widening that opportunity for making friendships and learning about, I don't know, effective relationship strategies. That sounds really clinical, but you know, like being a friend, it goes both ways, and it's not always about the person with Down syndrome or the person with special needs to accommodate the other people in your life.
Preach.
Yes, Danielle,
Yes.
preach. Exactly.
Yes.
The onus cannot be on the kids with Down syndrome, please.
Yes.
Very good.
You're absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for saying that. The onus does not have to be on our students all the time. And our families feel that really hard. And they get really upset about this kind of thing. Like, why is it always my child who has to, you know, conform to the rest of the group when we all know that it is harder for them? And so, yes, at your IEP meetings, you can push a little bit and say, I wonder if the whole class could benefit from turn-taking learning. And why don't we address this at the classroom level?
And also maybe they would enjoy not conforming a little bit too. Like, it doesn't have to look like, I don't know, what we're used to all the time.
Yeah, because that communication partner training can really go into the social skills and social interaction skills as well, and be for everybody in a lot of ways.
We can all learn to be better friends. Yeah. I was just curious what your thoughts were on this, the idea that it's great to have typically developing peers as friends, but also great to have other peers with Down syndrome as your friends as well, and how that changes as they get older. Susan,
I would love to talk about that.
Go for it.
Sure. That's something that I think, you know, all of us in this room, because we have been doing this for a long time, and we've seen, you know, all of the kids that we see here, we tend to see on an ongoing basis, right? And so we watch them develop, and we watch what happens to their friendships and things as they get older. And I think that an important thing to distinguish is the difference between real friendships and being popular at school. And so lots of parents will say to us, and I think all, you know, you're all nodding now, because lots of them will say, oh, she's so popular at school and everyone loves her, and she like gets high fives every time she goes down the hallway, and you know, everybody just wants to be around her, and they think she's so
Help
cute.
her,
And as a therapist, listening to parents say that now at this stage in my career here at DSRF, I mean, that's lovely, but there's always something now in the back of my brain where that unsettles me. It makes me feel uncomfortable, because what ends up happening most of the time, and this is why, and I never say anything about it, but it's why this forum is so great, because I don't have a parent actually standing in front of me. But it's basically like, you know, you are listening to them say this, and you're thinking in your head, but I know what will happen, right? I know what will happen is that they're loved right now, but then as soon as they hit around grade 4, the gap between the child with Down syndrome and the other kids in the class becomes too big in terms of their interests, in terms of their communicative abilities. I'm generalizing a little bit here. It's not always grade 4, but eventually that gap will get wider. And at that point, it is crucially important that the kids with Down syndrome start to build relationships with the people who will eventually be their peer group, which is not typically developing kids. It's kids with developmental disabilities. And so the earlier you can start to foster those kinds of relationships and create opportunities for those kinds of relationships, the relationships amongst kids who all have developmental disabilities, the better off your child is going to be. Right? And so that's just, it feels good to just get that out.
Just to get that off.
It really does. It's hard and it's sad, and we don't want to break any family's heart. But what we really care about is a balance in like power dynamics in friendship, right? And for a friendship to really be genuine, it's not just one child or teen sort of putting up with or appeasing another one or talking about My Little Pony for a little while or whatever. We would love for both people to be sort of like equally excited about the same things in a really genuine way. And in the instances where people with Down syndrome maintain friendships with typically developing people all the way through the end of high school, that's not a bad thing. But people who do that, those people leave.
They do.
They move away.
They get married. They move off to university.
And it is devastating.
It is.
And that's not the time to start building friendships with other people with Down syndrome. Also because then what we sometimes see is that people with Down syndrome are like, well, I don't want to be friends with other people with Down syndrome. Right. And that's problematic in itself. And then you're really up a tree at that point. It's a problem. And it can be prevented. It can be a both and, right? It doesn't have to be an either or.
No. I was just going to say, we've seen some families do that piece really well where they connect the kids at a younger age. And I think, especially at a center like us where we're located, we have families coming in from all over our city, right? So I think the geography or like your location can be a real barrier to supporting those friendships at a younger age, because it doesn't necessarily, and for anyone going to your high school or your elementary school, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get along with the people that you're at that school with. So I was going to say, so I think as much as you can do to support and put time in to connect your child with other people with developmental disabilities or what have you, just putting that time to help them and give them the opportunities to connect. And I was going to say, like, you don't need a ton of friends. My mom always said you just need one good one. And I think that's still true.
Very valid point.
That's very
And my last point, finally, I was going to say, like, observing some of our adult students now and kind of watching them develop their relationships where they've met people at different programs or in our classes here or at jobs. What's been really cool to see is that now, and again, it was always a barrier because they all lived across the city and some didn't transit and they had to rely on parents driving them, etc. But now with video calling and FaceTime, you really see these relationships get to develop a bit more because now they have that opportunity to connect.
Instant
outside
access.
of having to. Exactly. So it's been it's really been cool to see them do that.
And I think that it's, if you think about our friendship circles, like my most genuine friendships are with people that maybe we may not agree on everything or we may not think exactly alike, but we're on somewhat of a similar level, right? So who's to say that your friendships with another person with a developmental disability cannot be just as meaningful, if not more so, than a typically developing peer, like Marla had mentioned, because you're kind of thinking about common interests and how we look at things. And so if thinking about it from that perspective can sometimes make it a little bit easier to digest, like, okay, maybe they'll have more friends with developmental, or you do different things with different friends, right? Like some friends I'll just see occasionally, some I will, hang out with more often. So it can be both, but I think it's so important you brought up the fact that at a certain point when that transition happens and those typically developing peers are often doing their own thing, we need to avoid that pitfall at that time. So yeah.
I think part of our job or part of the work that goes into it is starting to kind of change that vision or helping parents to envision what a friendship could look like that's not solely based on like conversation and something that, you know, because I think that's how a lot of adults just learn to interact and you kind of forget about it. Or it's hard to picture what another type of really valuable friendship could look like. There's not a magical answer because we see just a plethora of wonderful relationships that look so different, but a common theme is to find somebody, you know, think about finding somebody who shares a similar sense of humor with your child. A lot of fun times and positive interactions kind of come from just having, being able to show and somebody appreciate your sense of humor, which can include a lot of nonverbal stuff or, modified verbal stuff. Also not to be afraid of finding situations, if you're not sure where to start, you don't know anybody who you think would be a great fit to be a friend with your son or daughter or child, then it's okay to look for those kind of facilitated and more organized situations or events or clubs or groups where some of these interactions can be a bit facilitated that are based on shared experiences, not just, putting two people with Down syndrome or other developmental disabilities in a room together and expecting they'll get along. Which I think unfortunately is sometimes something to watch out for in schools where they'll create groups thinking that these two people who share just a diagnosis
are going to like each other.
Totally. And we just know that is not true. It's wonderful when it happens, but
I thought that the word you used about they're really popular, right? I think that goes with typically developing relationships as well. You can label someone as really popular, but it doesn't mean that they have meaningful below the surface relationships with the people that adore them, right? They could also feel very lonely. So just figuring out, like Riley said, those things that they do have in common with whoever they choose to be friends with. And
and sometimes, like Riley was describing, the friendships don't look conventional, but that doesn't mean that people aren't having an amazing time. I can think of a couple of guys from a class that Eleanor and I taught a long time ago, a decade ago, and they would get together and they would just kind of riff off each other and have their one-liner inside jokes, and it was a lot of cupcake, shortcake, and cake, but I didn't know what was happening. I don't think Eleanor knew what was happening either, but what was clear was they were having a great time. And they were so enjoying
connecting
being together.
on
They
their own
looked
level.
forward to it every time. And that is genuine friendship.
And they're still
best
good friends and they hang out and they do stuff together. And the cupcake jokes still are
going strong.
Over there. Yeah.
But you know what? It's valid. It's a genuine friendship, and it's something that's served both of them for a decade now.
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah.
I love those guys. They remember all the details too. They know each other's birthdays. They celebrate them.
I mean, seriously, how meaningful of a friendship is that when you know details about your friend and you could that's just such a bond, right?
They watch hockey games, drink beer.
Have a great time. It's really good. Yeah. Well, we appreciate all of you guys coming and soapboxing with us. Hopefully for parents who have listened this far in, it's been a long time that we've been chatting now. You come away with some ideas around you know what, I think this thing is important and I'm going to act on this. Yeah. And this other thing, I'm going to, I thought it was important and maybe I'm going to let it rest for a little bit here. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no guilt though.
But no guilt.
That's
exactly.
my last word.
Please.
Sorry, I had to get one more in there. No guilt for parents.
Yeah.
No, we're all learning things every day.
That's
right.
Yeah.
Everybody's learning new things.
This is just a few things that we've learned and we're you know what? We're just going to share them. Come talk to us. This is a safe space.
Yeah. I think we should redo this episode in a year or two and say everything that we said today that was wrong and we learned better.
That's probably going to happen.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really important point that we are not coming from a place of we know everything. No. This is just based off our experience. And that's why I love working here, because it's a collaboration not only amongst us as professionals, but you as parents and caregivers. You need to tell us about your experiences and what you're learning, and we can work on it together. But it's just a few things that I think after years and years of working there's some patterns and things that we're it's interesting. Let's just bring it up for consideration.
Shout out to the parents.
Shout out to the parents. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And to all of our kids. and students too for working really hard. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, thank you again, you guys, so much. It was a pleasure.
Always.
And hopefully
Thanks for
we'll have you
having
back
us.
on again. All right.